Well, before we get into this, because we live in a broken world and we're on mission to help people see and follow Jesus, God uses problems in the broken world to help people intersect with His good news, His gospel. And so here's some more resources that I just want to highlight that might give you some wisdom in helping approach people where they're at. This one is called, Is God Listening? What if He doesn't answer? Come across people like that here. How are you going to approach that? This is a resource you can check out and return. Struggling through singleness, help for the journey. Motives. Why do I do the things that I do? Here's one that might seem a little lighter, but it has profound effects on our world. When to get my kids a phone. Navigating the tensions. Thinking wisely about that. And financial crisis. What to do when the bottom drops out. God gives us wisdom in His Word to help give truth to a world that needs to see the light of Jesus. Lee read Genesis chapter 2, and yes, we're going to be in Song of Solomon, but Genesis chapter 2 sets the framework, doesn't it? It describes what it was. It describes the ideal of what God put together with one man, one woman, for life, unashamed. And it sets the stage for all of that. And that's where the Song of Solomon is going to go, but we got to think about what it was in the beginning. But as we approach this book, the Song of Solomon here, what's the Song of Solomon about? What would you say? What's the Song of Solomon about? You could be frank and honest. We are a safe group here this morning. What is the Song of Solomon about? Romance? Any answer's okay, guys. Christ in the church? Unity and love. Warren. What's that? Passion? All right. When you were kids and you read the Song of Solomon, or you found it in your Bible that first time, what were you thinking? I want you to see this morning here that the Song of Solomon is relevant for all people. Some of us are going to automatically put this book in the category, okay, of married men and women here. But this book is relevant for all, whether you are single, whether you're married, whether you're divorced, whether you're young or whether you're old, whether you're thinking about marriage or not thinking about marriage, whether you have a happy marriage or a very broken marriage, whether your marriage is sexually healthy or you are sexually broken. This book here is about that. And by the way, sexually healthy and sexually broken, I'm also talking about singles as well. Because it's not only unmarried people here who may, as you read this Song of Solomon, you might feel left out. It could be people in unhappy marriages or people struggling with sexual brokenness in this world. You may feel excluded by this book. Because I want you to know that frustrating feeling you might have is the song itself does not confine its message to just happily married people. In fact, reading the song actually with a focus on marriage actually missed the bigger point here of what the book's all about. Well, we'll get to that. But because the Song of Solomon is not just a celebration, it's also a warning. It's a warning. It's actually framed by a conversation between the central woman and a group called the Daughters of Jerusalem. And they kind of stand for all the readers of the song, not just the women. And 3 times in this book, the woman addresses her audience with a Hebrew word that's used to make strong, even legally binding oaths in the ancient world. She says something to the effect of, I adjure you, daughters of Jerusalem, that you don't awaken or stir up love until it pleases. And her warning reveals that the poem is for people who may not be in this particular description of Song of Solomon with these 2 lovers. And it gives people who may not even be experiencing the type of love in the song a window and some wise truth here to reflect on the type of relationships and prepare our hearts for conducting ourselves wisely. It's also a very honest picture. I know when I said, what is the Song of Solomon all about? I know it came to mind, but you didn't feel like you could be honest with that, perhaps. Especially in a large group, right? But it's an honest picture, isn't it? It provides a safe window into love in its two directions, different ways it can go to pursue what's good. But look at chapter 1, verse 1. I want you to see this. It says the Song of Songs, which is Solomon's. When it says the Song of Songs, that's a Hebrew expression that's a superlative. A superlative is like good, better, best, right? Big, bigger, biggest is how we do it normally in English. Well, when he says Song of Songs here, what he's saying is, like you would see in other places, like slave of slaves, or holy of holies, or in Ecclesiastes, vanity of vanities, the worst vanity, right? Lord of hosts, the greatest Lord. And the Song of Songs is the song, the best song here. 1 Kings 4, verse 32 says, Solomon spoke 3,000 proverbs and 1,005 songs. And so he was the one who wrote this. And the reason I said if, because that Hebrew phrase, which is Solomon's, could read of Solomon or about Solomon. Here it's a possibility. It's not like a letter where in the letters in the New Testament it says Paul to the so-and-sos, right? Like he's writing it. It could be about Solomon here. It could be written by him. Many have interpreted it as being written by him. But the point is, that's not the point. The point means that this was the Song of Songs. This is the best song. It's the best song. And it's been interpreted so many different ways, which is why I come to this book with fear and trepidation, because it can be many ways through the rabbis interpreted as it meant Israel and Yahweh, the Lord, an allegory for them. Or after Christ came, many of the believers interpreted it as the church and Christ here, and they would allegorize it. It means they would find symbolic things in it that represented certain things. Like give an example in chapter 1, verse 13. It talks about the lover who is between my breasts, she says. And so some of the old guys would say, well, that was the Old Testament, one of the breasts. The other breast was the New Testament. There, and it's Christ. Or in chapter 2, verse 12, it says, the voice of the turtle dove heard in our land. Well, that is the preaching of the apostles. Or eating honey and drinking wine in chapter 5, verse 1. That's a description of the Lord's Supper. And you have in your hymn book some hymns written by a guy named Bernard of Clairvaux. He wrote a lot of hymns that we sing. And he wrote 78 sermons on the first 2 chapters of the book before he died. And it's probably good he died. Here, because who knows how many he would have come up with here, but each one is a detailed allegory of this is a picture of Christ here. Or it could be interpreted as just kind of on the face value. This is an erotic book that is a guide to biblical lovemaking. I actually have a book by a Messianic Christian, a Jewish Christian, and it's called A Biblical Guide to Lovemaking, and it's an exposition of the Song of Solomon. Or you could see that it's a story. It's a drama of 2 main characters, Solomon and the Shulamite bride. If you got the Merrill Unger Bible Dictionary, this is what you would read. King Solomon had a vineyard in the hill country of Ephraim, about 50 miles north of Jerusalem. He rented it out to keepers, consisting of a mother, 2 sons, and 2 daughters, the Shulamite and a little sister. The Shulamite was the Cinderella of the family, naturally beautiful but unnoticed. Her brothers were likely half-brothers. They made her work very hard tending the vineyard, so she had little opportunity to care for her personal appearance. She pruned the vines and set traps for the little foxes. She also kept the flocks. Being out in the open so much, she became sunburned. One day a handsome stranger came to the vineyard. It was Solomon disguised. He showed an interest in her, and she became embarrassed concerning her personal appearance. She took him for a shepherd and asked about his flocks. He answered evasively, but also spoke loving words to her and promised rich gifts for the future. He won her heart and left with the promise that someday he would return. She dreamed of him that night and sometimes thought he was near. Finally, he did return in all of his kingly splendor to make her his bride. This prefigures Christ. That's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it, and that's a very common way to look at it. By the way, don't look at your notes. Don't look at your headings in the Song of Solomon. They'll mess you up. All right? Those are inserted by interpreters later. Another way to look at it is see three main characters in this. There's a Shulamite woman, there's a shepherd lover, and then there's a king, probably Solomon. And so Will Varner, a professor of New Testament, he sees the story as this. There's a family living at Shulam. They consisted of a widowed mother and several sons and one daughter who maintained themselves by farming and shepherding. The brothers were particularly fond of their sister, and they took her under their special care, promising that her wise behavior and her virtue would be greatly rewarded by them in chapter 8, 8 through 14. In the course of time, while tending the flock, and according to the custom of the shepherds, resorting at noon beneath a tree for shelter against the midday sun, she met with a graceful shepherd youth to whom she afterward became betrothed. One morning in the spring, this youth invited her to accompany him into the field, but the brothers overheard the invitation and, anxious for the reputation of their sister, sent her to take care of the vineyards in order to prevent their meeting. The damsel, however, consoled her beloved and herself with the assurance that those separated bodily, indissoluble ties existed between them over which her brothers had no control. She requested him to meet her in the evening, and when he didn't come, she feared that there was some accident that happened to him on the way. She went in search of him and found him, and the evening was now the only time in which they can enjoy each other's company, as during the day she was occupied in the vineyards. On one occasion, when entering the garden, she accidentally came into the presence of King Solomon, 6, 11, and 12, who happened to be on a summer visit to the neighborhood. Struck with the beauty of the damsel, the king conducted her into his royal tent, and there, assisted by his court ladies, his harem, endeavored with alluring flatteries and promises to gain her affections, but without effect. Released from the king's presence, the damsel sought an interview with her beloved shepherd. The king, however, took her to his capital in great pomp in the hope of dazzling her with his splendor. But neither did this prevail, because while even there, she told her beloved shepherd, who had followed her to the capital and obtained an interview with her, that she was anxious to leave the gaudy scene for her own home. The shepherd, on hearing this, praised her constancy, and such a manifestation of their mutual attachment took place that several of the court ladies were greatly affected by it. The king, still determined, if possible, to win her affection, watched for another favorable opportunity, and with flatteries and allurements surpassing all that he had used before, tried to obtain his purpose. He promised to elevate her to the highest rank and to raise her above his concubines and queens if she would agree to his wishes. But faithful to her espousals, she refused all his overtures on the plea that her affections were pledged to another. The king, convinced at last that he could not possibly prevail, was obliged to dismiss her, and the shepherdess, in company with her beloved shepherd, returned to her native home. On the way home, they visited the tree where they had first met, and there renewed their vows of faithfulness to each other. On her arrival in safety at her home, her brother, in accordance with the promise, rewarded her greatly for her virtuous conduct, accompanied by a final reproval of Solomon. Well, there's some things actually that can be said for that one, because it does seem that there's three main characters here in the story: a woman, a shepherd, and a king. But I think it oversimplifies and overemphasizes the story, and it's got some holes in it. But I want to tell you here, and plus it's just pulling everything from everything and trying to piece together a story from it, but that's not how it's written. What is clear here is the main character in this story is not the king. It's not the shepherd. It is the woman. She's like Lady Wisdom in Proverbs, pursuing love that is exclusive and affectionate and intimate and mutual. She speaks the most in this story. And most of the guys in the story, the king, the brothers, the guards, they actually aren't very nice if you read it. And some are downright abusive to her. The shepherd lover character seems to be the only one concerned for her and not himself. And there is also some other women, as I mentioned, called Daughters of Jerusalem. And they play an important role in the Song of Solomon as the woman's conversation partner. She turns them and speaks. And many times, they're a character here that is used to connect to the audience and connect the audience and understand that the woman's speaking to the audience, those who are reading this. And as we read her instructions to the daughters, you can see this in 2:7, in 3:5, and 8:4. we're supposed to receive it as instructions as us as readers. So who are the daughters of Jerusalem? Well, some people say they could just be women who live in Jerusalem. They could be Solomon's harem. Remember, he had a few wives. Or they could be unmarried women. They're virgin friends of the woman. And there's been a lot of parallels between the book of Proverbs that's written to a son to see wisdom here and how to live, and this woman and the daughters in the song, like the counterpart book of wisdom for women. And many times they're called on to celebrate what's going on with a woman and her lover, and to notice how mutual and exclusive and affectionate their love is, and they're given frequent warnings. So who are they and what are they for? I believe in the world of the song here, this ancient Near East world here, they're characterized as young women, but they stand in for all reading. Not just young women, though that would be primary emphasis, but in the same way that my son in Proverbs stands in for all who are reading, not just young men. And they are key to understanding the book of Song of Solomon. So you see them come up, put a little light bulb above your head here and think, okay, this is what she's trying to say. And there's a phrase that the woman keeps saying to them to get her point across. Have you ever noticed it? There's a warning there. But then the biggest question in all this is, what about Solomon? He does appear in this book, even by name. Where does he fit? What's Solomon doing in the song? And there's so many different opinions on this. Here it can be overwhelming. But usually it takes one of three things. Solomon's one of two main characters in the song. He's the beloved. Or he's one of three characters in the song, and the woman and her beloved are the main characters, and he's the antagonist. Or some would even say Solomon isn't in the song and doesn't have very much to do with it. There's names there just to evoke ideas about Solomon. But I think the second one is more close to what we're going to see in a Song of Solomon. So it maybe begs a question. So, in the Bible, is Solomon a good guy or is he a bad guy? And what would you say to that? Both. It's complicated, isn't it? Solomon is one of the most complex characters in the whole Old Testament. On one hand, he's remembered for several positive achievements. And on the other hand, the writers don't mince any words explaining where his heart was in the end. And so this morning, here, I want you to see Solomon because it's going to set up really what the story is all about. By having you turn to 2 Samuel, please. 2 Samuel chapter 12. 2 Samuel chapter 12. Let's start right at the very beginning with Solomon here. And we'll hit some mile markers along his life to see what is Solomon? What's he about? So if you go to 2 Samuel 12, verse 24. It says, And David comforted Bathsheba his wife, and went in unto her, and lay with her, and she bare a son. And he called his name Solomon. And then what does it say? The Lord loved him. We're going to trace that word love here for Solomon's life and see where that goes. And he sent by the hand of Nathan the prophet, and he called his name Jedediah. You know what Jedediah means? Some of you have a little footnote in your Bible there of what that name means. It means beloved of the Lord. Beloved of the Lord. Jedediah. The Lord named him Jedediah because of the Lord. So right away, what do you notice? What's significant about Solomon? The Lord what? The Lord loves him. And he gives him this name, Jedediah, which means, you are my beloved. Beloved by the Lord. Now, he becomes king after David. And in Deuteronomy chapter 17, God had given instructions to the Israelites for when they got a king. And I want you to turn to Deuteronomy 17 and notice something here. Because the author of the book of Kings is going to keep that in mind, and he's going to start dropping things about Solomon that's going to remind us of this passage. So, if you go to Deuteronomy chapter 17, at verse 14, you're going to see some instructions given for when they get a king. And we saw this in Saul and when we went through Saul's life in 1 Samuel. But look at verse 16, Deuteronomy 17. He shall not multiply horses to himself, nor cause the people to return to Egypt, to the end that he shall multiply horses, for as much as the Lord had said to you, he shall henceforth return no more that way. Neither shall he multiply wives to himself, that his heart turn not away. Neither shall he greatly multiply to himself silver and gold. And it shall be, when he sitteth upon the throne of his kingdom, that he shall write him a copy of this law in a book out of that which is before the priests and Levites, the book of Deuteronomy. And it shall be with him, and he shall read therein all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, to keep all the words of this law and these statutes, to do them, that his heart be not lifted up above his brethren. He's under the same law as the rest of the Israelites. And that he turn not aside from the commandment to the right hand or the left, to the end, to the goal, that he may prolong his days in his kingdom, he and his children, in the midst of Israel. Okay, so that's what the king's supposed to do. He's supposed to have the law of God, Deuteronomy, and it's supposed to be on his mind. He's supposed to be reviewing it here so that he reigns properly. And then there are things he's not to do, right? Or some things he wasn't to do. In that. Horses, all right? Get a lot of horses, multiply horses. What else? Go to Egypt, have connections to Egypt. What else? What's that? Yeah, get rich. Get rich. Hoard wealth, right? And he wasn't supposed to marry many wives. Well, he's the first son of David to take the throne. You remember God's promise to David. He builds the temple in Jerusalem, God's house. He receives special wisdom from God to govern his people. And he reigns over a dazzling period of prosperity and peace for Israel. Everybody sits under their vine and their fig tree. That's like saying everybody's got a three-car garage here. And Proverbs is full of his wisdom, right? Well, let's get to 1 Kings 3. And what do you notice there? 1 Kings 3. 1 to 3. So he's starting to get established here. And right away, what do you notice in 1 Kings 3? The author doesn't comment on it, but he drops us a little yellow light, blinking slowly. And what do you notice in there? Who does he marry? Someone from Egypt, Pharaoh's daughter. Why does he marry her? Does it give you any clues? What's that? An alliance. An alliance. So he marries Pharaoh's daughter. In the Hebrew, the language that this Bible was written in 1 Kings 3, verse 1, literally says, he made himself a son-in-law to Pharaoh. He made himself the son-in-law of Pharaoh. So the union was more for what? An alliance, political alliance, right? Between the leaders of Israel and Egypt. And what did Deuteronomy say about that? Now, is he going down to Egypt? Not necessarily, right? He's not leading the nation back to Egypt, but what is he doing? He's going to the same Egypt that God had rescued his people, that God said, don't go back to that again. Now, go to 1 Kings chapter 4. 1 Kings 4. Next page. 1 Kings 4 and verse 20 through 34. We don't have time to read it, but you can see, like verse 21, Solomon reigned. He brought presents and served Solomon all the day of his life. If you look in verse 22 and 23, you see everything he has. 25, Judah and Israel dwelt safely, every man under his vine and under his fig tree, from Dan to Beersheba. That's like saying from Florida to Maine. There, all the days of Solomon. And then what do you see about verse 26? He had 40,000 stalls of horses for his chariots and 12,000 horsemen. Okay. And then, how is his relationship with the Lord? It's still good. It's still good, but if you continue reading to 34, does it sound like he's pretty successful? But what do you notice in here that Deuteronomy 17 talks about? What's Solomon, where's his focus starting to go? He's starting to build his own kingdom, right? He's starting to be more concerned with that. Then go to chapter 6 and verse 37. Again, the author doesn't comment on it, but he tells us these things.